Good evening, everyone. We are continuing our study in the Old Testament tonight. Tonight, we're going to be looking at Judges chapter 6, 7, and 8, which is a survey of Gideon, one of the judges of Israel. In Judges chapter 6, a familiar theme is started off, where it says the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. This repeats a cycle that we've already talked about as we studied Judges. I've talked about it, Aurelio, and thank you to Aurelio for doing such a fine job in filling in for me as I was recovering from COVID. I'm doing fine now. I really do appreciate Aurelio just being so willing to do what needed to be done, both preaching and teaching. He's a fine man. We are very blessed to have him. But in Judges chapter 6, as I said, the writer continues a theme that we've mentioned before that will be repeated often. Israel goes through a cycle. The people of Israel do what is evil in the sight of God. God subjects them to slavery. They cry out to God for deliverance. God gives them a deliverer, a judge, and then they serve God for a period of time. And this cycle goes over and over and over again with the people of Israel. We're told in chapter 6 that the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. And the hand of Midian overpowered Israel. Because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. So you can imagine this wasn't a very pleasant time in Israel's history, that they are having to hide out from their enemies because of their fear. Now, they got to this place because they stopped serving God. They became unfaithful to God, and God punished them. That will always be the consequence of being unfaithful to God. You are faithful to God, God will bless you. You are unfaithful to God, God will curse you. And those curses can find the form of absolute defeat. Those curses can find the form of death, a disease, or at least many obstacles set in front of a person as they're trying to simply live life. Serve God and you'll be blessed. Don't serve God and you'll have difficulty. Now, that's not to say that if you serve God, you won't have any difficulty, because God uses those difficulties in order to make us what he would have us be. If you ever wonder about that, read James chapter 1 and verses 2 to 4, where James teaches his readers, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. I hope this is recording better than I can see it recording, because it looks like my audio is about a few seconds behind how my mouth is moving. But nevertheless, carry on. I shouldn't have said that. Technology is what it is. And so Gideon then is called to deliver Israel at this time when they are suffering at the hand of the Midianites. When God calls Gideon, immediately we are introduced to something about Gideon's character. And it's not so much that it's a bad thing. Maybe to some extent it's human nature. Gideon, for all his worth, for all his value to the people of Israel, and in his service to God, he's a little bit reluctant in what he does. He's reluctant here when he is first chosen. We will see his reluctance later as he serves God. And so Gideon, for me and for you, is a good role model. not because he is always what he should be, but because sometimes he's a little bit hesitant. Sometimes he's a bit reluctant to do what he needs to do and to do it boldly and before all who can see. When we're first introduced to him here, we're told that the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. Now, this is not necessarily a cowardice thing. It's a wise thing to be doing. Because were the Midianites to find what he was doing, they'd take the wheat and they'd probably destroy him. So Gideon is simply taking necessary precautions to protect himself and the work that he is doing. And then he is called Almighty Man of Valor by the angel of the Lord. Almighty Man of Valor. He is called by God to serve God, to deliver the people of Israel. And God says to him in verse 16, I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. Gideon responds to that with, if I found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign. Like I said, Gideon is sometimes reluctant to simply do what he's been called to do. And isn't that the way with many people? We know what we should do, but maybe we hesitate, we pause, we wait, we wonder if God is going to give us a sign to indicate that he's really going to give us success. And so Gideon is very much like me. Gideon is very much like you, I feel I can confidently say. Gideon wants a sign from God that God is going to give him success. Now, God doesn't scold Gideon for that here. He gives him the sign that he asked for. One of the more well-known episodes in Gideon's life is found in the last part of chapter 6, where we're told in the scripture that Gideon destroys the altar of Baal. Now think about what a bold thing this was, not only because of the Midianites, but now because the Israelites who were serving the Midianites and had gone after the Midianites' God. You have the Israelites now who are every bit as much Baal worshipers as Gideon is a worshiper of God. It says in chapter 6 and verse 28, when the men of the town rose early in the morning, behold, the altar of Baal was broken down, and the Asherah beside it was cut down. And they said to one another, who has done this thing? And they searched, and they finally concluded it is Gideon who has done it. Then the men of the town say to Joash, Gideon's father, bring him here that your son may die, for he has broken down the altar of Baal and cut down the Asherah beside it. Now again, think about how Israel has descended into idolatry here. No longer are they standing up for the holiness of God. No longer are they taking their stand with Gideon for tearing down these idols, but rather bring him out so that he may die. Now, I love Gideon's father's reply. He says, you're upset that the altar of Baal has been torn down? Is Baal a god? Let Baal contend for himself. Let Baal contend for himself. And so from this point on, Gideon's fame grows, and he is renamed by the name of Jerubbaal, which means the one who contends with Baal. It says in verse 33, all the Midianites, the Amalekites, the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet. And the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. Then another episode in Gideon's life that is pretty familiar to us. In verse 36 and following, you have the sign of the fleece. Now, as I said earlier, Gideon is somewhat of a reluctant fellow. He knows what he needs to do. He knows that when God gives him a command, he's to obey it. But simply because a person knows what they need to do, simply because a person believes God, that doesn't mean that sometimes there won't be some hesitancy. That doesn't mean that sometimes there won't be some desire to bargain with God somewhat. Now, we don't need any better example for the truthfulness of what I'm saying than Jesus himself. You remember when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night he was to be crucified. What was his prayer to God? Let this cup pass from me. And he prayed this 3 times to the Father. Let this cup pass from me. Let this cup pass from me, and let this cup pass from me. And finally, Jesus surrenders to his Father's will when he said, not my will, but yours be done. And so what I'm saying is a reluctant spirit is not always an indication of faithlessness. A reluctant spirit is the struggle that we have because we realize that the threat that we are afraid of may be very real, and it may even be successful. But will we serve God anyway? Now let's read this story about Gideon and the fleece. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I'm laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early in the morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Now stop there for a moment. God has already told Gideon, you're my man. Almighty man of valor, you're going to deliver the people of Israel. You're my man. Now, if we're thinking very idealistically, we might say, well, Gideon ought to just have jumped at the opportunity. But Gideon is hesitant. He's reluctant because evidently there's an element of concern as to whether or not he's going to be successful. And so just to make sure, he comes up with a test for God. He says, let me lay this fleece on the ground. And in the morning, if the fleece by itself is saturated, but the ground is dry, then I'll know that you want me to deliver Israel. And so God grants him that request, and exactly Gideon's request happens. Then in verse 39, you have this. Then Gideon said to God, don't be angry with me. Let me ask once more. Let me test once more with the fleece. This time, let it be dry, let the fleece be dry, and all of the ground be wet with dew. And so God granted that request as well. It was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground was dew. So, what do we learn about a relationship with God from Gideon here? We learn that God calls us to faithfulness all the time. God wants us to do his will all the time. But God is also merciful with us when we're reluctant, when we're hesitant. We would like to be able to consider ourselves as strong men and women of God who always jump at the chance to serve God, to do whatever God calls us to do. That's how we'd like to picture ourselves. Remember the Apostle Peter, when Jesus said, "You're all going to desert me." And what was Peter's answer? Peter says, "Oh, Lord, if everybody else does, I won't." Peter was sure of himself. He was convinced that he would pass the test with flying colors. And we know what happened. Peter failed. And Peter failed in a shameful, most miserable way. And later on, after Jesus was raised from the dead, he tells the woman, "Go tell the apostles and tell Peter." Well, isn't Peter included in the apostles? Of course he is. But Jesus has a special concern for Peter because of his failure. Because of his hesitancy, Jesus shows him mercy. And so you and I, when we are faced with a trial or some heartache, something that is testing our faith, don't give up simply because you go through a season of reluctance or being hesitant. God is merciful. God is merciful, and God will bring you through this situation. You just keep on trusting him through your reluctance, through your hesitancy, through your doubt, through your heartache. God will bring you through this thing. Gideon was hesitant, and God blessed him. Gideon was hesitant and reluctant, and God brought him victory. Because even in the midst of his hesitancy and his reluctance, he was still for God, and God knew that. And God was for getting Gideon to where he wanted him to be. So don't be so quick to give up on yourself. Don't be so quick to give up on other people. Because we all fail. From time to time, each one of us fail to be what God would have us be. But God will bring us through, and he will make us stand. Then in chapter 7, another well-known story about Gideon. Gideon is ready to go into battle. And we're told in chapter 7, all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, "There's too many folks with you." Now think about how our lives, our minds tend to operate. If we were about ready to wage a battle, wouldn't we want as many men of valor as we could possibly get? Wouldn't we want more soldiers, more weapons, better soldiers? Wouldn't we want to put the odds as greatly as possible in our favor for success? Of course we would. That's human nature. to bring an overwhelming force against the opponent so that there can be no doubt that we will be victorious. You see, there's the problem. So that there will be no doubt we will be victorious. God says to Gideon, you've got too many people with you, too many men. Because if you go into this battle and you're successful, you win with this great army, what is going to be the tendency of the people? Pounding the chest. Look how strong we are. Look what we did. We defeated Midian with an overwhelming force. And so to keep that from happening, God says there's too many people. Too many people. And God trims down their forces to 300 men. First of all, it says in verse 3, God tells Gideon to proclaim to the people, say, whoever is fearful and trembling, go home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Now imagine you've got the people on the edge of battle. And certainly there are some people that are scared to death. Now, it might be easy for us as armchair observers to sneer at those who are fearful. But when you have people stepping into battle and knowing that many in the front lines are going to be killed, knowing it for a certainty, then you can understand that there would be many that would be fearful. So God tells Gideon, tell everybody that's afraid, go home. And 22,000 people left. Now that gives us an idea of the vastness of this army. You start off here apparently with 32,000 men, because 22,000 leave, 10,000 remain. Okay, so the army has been whittled down significantly. Certainly it's acceptable to God that if you started off with this 32,000, 22,000 people who are afraid go home. Certainly it's going to be acceptable to God for these 10,000 to go into battle. God says to Gideon, no, that's still too many. And so he has a test to weed out even more people. He says, this is what I want you to do. Take the people down to the water. Everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set him by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped water, I will save you, and I will give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go every man to his home. Now think about that. Why did God choose this method of weeding out the people of Israel? I was listening to an Old Testament, sitting in class one time, actually listening to the teacher lecture on this episode And the class was asked, why this method? What was indicated by one who would be lapping water from his hand, as opposed to one who would be down on his knees drinking water directly from the pool? And some people concluded the one who is lapping water most likely is a man who has got his eyes on the horizon. He's got his spear in his hand, and he's ready to fight at a moment's notice. Now that's heart-stirring to think that God is choosing men who are especially conscious for battle, who are especially ready for battle. So is that so? Or is it so that this test, as far as humans are concerned, doesn't mean a thing? Why choose people who cup the water in their hands and lap it like a dog? Why choose those folks over those who are down on their knees and drinking directly from the source? Maybe it's an indication of a strong, valiant spirit. Maybe it has nothing to do with that. Why does God choose this? We don't know. But the point is, God takes what to man might seem a puzzling requirement and make that the condition for which a man goes into battle. God doesn't have to explain himself to anyone. Gideon doesn't quiz God as to why this is happening. Gideon just does it. Like I said, sometimes Gideon's reluctant. Sometimes he just does what God says. And so God whittles down this force to 300 people to take the people of the Midianites. Then in the rest of chapter 7, we're told that Gideon indeed defeats Midian. And there are even people within Midian who know that the defeat is a certainty. Gideon's victories continue in chapter 8. And after all of Gideon's military successes, he gets to the point, and Israel gets to the point, that they want to make Gideon king because they have seen the great leadership that is in him, and certainly they have seen the success that God has given him. And so in verse 22 of chapter 8, the men of Israel say to Gideon, "Rule over us, you and your son." Gideon said, "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you." And so instead, Gideon makes a request. He says, "Take some of the spoil that you have gained from the Midianites and lay it out." And Gideon took all of that spoil and made an ephod of it. And it becomes a trap. It says in verse 27 of chapter 8, Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all Israel whored after it, and it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. But nevertheless, the closing note to describe Gideon's life is that Midian was subdued before the people of Israel, and they raised their heads no more. And the land had rest for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Verse 33, as soon as Gideon died, the people of Israel turned again and whored after the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. And so Israel continues this cycle. Serve God, go into servitude, gain victory, start trusting in something other than God, lose status and relationship with God, go back into servitude. And so Gideon was a good leader for the people of Israel. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't flawless. We've seen that. But he served God. He served God in spite of his flaws, in spite of his shortcoming, in spite of his sin. And so Gideon is something of a hero to the people of Israel. Now, next Wednesday night, we are going to resume having Bible class in the church house, in the auditorium. These Old Testament Bible studies will still continue to be posted on Facebook and then on YouTube. So if you don't feel comfortable getting out yet, make sure you tune in with us as we continue this study. But we will be having Wednesday night Bible class in the church house next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. So hope you can be with us either in person or virtually through the internet. God bless you. Until next time.